Right now, though, as we've been promising you, we're going to the celebrity guest line. When I was 24, 25 years old back in 91 and 92, working for a weekly newspaper in Titusville, Florida called the Star Advocate, I also got an opportunity to do some writing on a freelance basis for the parent paper, the Florida Today, and came across this gentleman who was kind enough to befriend me and got a chance to watch a guy who I have considered all these years to be one of the best in the business go about his craft. Peter Kerasotis has written a new book with Felipe Alou called Alou, My Baseball Journey, and he joins us here to talk about that book, among other things, on the program today. Peter, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Dan. Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and as I said that, I got to thinking, well, that probably makes him feel old because it made me feel old as well.
I just turned 60.
Well, you know what? That's not as bad as I thought. Then I just turned 51 back in April, so we're not that far apart.
No, the gap closes rather than widens the older we all get.
Yeah, it's
9 years when we were kids was a lifetime.
Yeah, it's funny how that works, isn't it? It's good to hear from you again, and I appreciate you answering when I reached out to you on Twitter when I saw the book and saw that you had joined the world of social media. I had to reach out because people here know that as much as I love all sports, baseball is my thing, and to get an opportunity to talk to you about this book and this subject, I thought would be a good deal. So I appreciate you being willing to spend a little time with us. You've been doing quite a few of these from what I understand.
I've done 4 books. I should know that right off the top of my head. 4, and I'm working on a 5th.
Go ahead.
This one, Dan, this one is really special for your listeners who may not know, because Felipe Alou is he's going to be 83. Felipe was the first guy to leave the Dominican Republic and become a major league player, and now the Dominican produces more major league players than any other country outside of the United States. That small Caribbean island, some great players, the Albert Pujolses and the Pedro Martinezes, and the list is on and on and on. The first guy to leave that island, so he is their Jackie Robinson in many ways, because the book kind of weaves in and out of what Latino players like him encountered when they came to this country, which was double racism, not just from white America, obviously, but also black America, because the black communities would embrace the Latinos to a degree. They were still second-class citizens in the black communities because they were from another country. They didn't speak English at all or not very well. You can go to our barbershops, you can eat at our little places, but, don't be dating our women, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
First Dominican to play in the World Series, first Dominican to become a major league manager. Borderline Hall of Fame career as a player. The 3 brothers together, Felipe and then Matty and then Jesus, all of them very good players. At one time, historically played all 3 outfield positions together for the San Francisco Giants. He is the only man to have played in the first season the Giants had in San Francisco and the first season the Braves had, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with him because of the proximity to Atlanta. The first played not only for the Giants the first year in San Francisco, but the Braves the first year in Atlanta. Father of Moises Alou, who was a great player also. So he has a very rich baseball story and a very rich family story as well. And that's what we captured in his autobiography in this book. Close friends with Roberto Clemente. There's a whole chapter about their brotherhood kind of friendship that they had. Roomed with Joe Torre when they both played for the Braves. Just a lot. He was Barry Bonds' manager when Bonds broke the home run record.
Mm-hmm.
So just a lot of things in that book, a lot of layers to it. And he is a very, very revered figure in baseball amongst people who really know him. Tony La Russa got a hold of He read the manuscript and provided a blurb for the back of the book. and he's just been raving about it. I keep hearing from people around the country, I've been hearing about this book, or before it actually published, I've been hearing about this book coming out. Where are you hearing about it? Tony La Russa. Tony La Russa has been really talking about it. So I'm very, I've done several books, but this one, Dan, is I knew I had some gold nuggets going in. I really struck a gold mine with this story.
Well, Peter, what was your prior connection to Felipe Alou, and why did you decide to do this book?
Well, it's interesting you asked that because, you lived in this area, and you remember when I was a columnist at Florida Today, and as a columnist, I was always looking for ideas. And spring training, when the Marlins used to be in Vieira, which is in Brevard County, when, as you know, your listeners, it's all the same county here, Titusville, where you worked, and where I worked in Central Brevard, South Brevard, and Vieira. And the Marlins were there, and I was looking at rosters and different teams that were coming in and trying to generate some column ideas. And I happened to be looking at Felipe Alou's bio when he was the manager of the Expos, and the Expos were still a team, Montreal Expos. And I saw he started his career in Cocoa, Florida, as a minor leaguer at the old Provost Park where the Cocoa Indians played. And so when the Expos came up, I introduced myself during batting practice. Mr. Alou, I'm so-and-so, I'm a local columnist. I don't know if you remember, but you started your career about 5-10 miles from here in Cocoa. Do you remember anything about it? And Dan, you're always looking for a local connection.
Right.
Well, he not only remembered that he led the league with a .380 batting average, led him in stolen bases. He remembered the street he lived on, that family that housed him. Then he started to tell me how he really started his career in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in the Evangeline League, but they wouldn't let him play because he was black. They actually passed a law because they didn't want blacks working with whites, and he only got 9 at-bats, and there was a white family that housed him, and he'd have to crouch down below the window whenever he was going to the ballpark with them or coming home. They actually put their lives in danger, and his life was in danger. And so the Giants, seeing that he wasn't going to be able to play there, sent him to Cocoa. And he said, I was on a Greyhound bus, and he starts to tell me this story about how his dream was to become a doctor, and he was in school at the University of Santo Domingo to become a doctor, the oldest of 6 children. That was his goal. That was what he wanted to do ever since he was a kid. He played in the Pan Am Games, led them to the gold medal, beat the United States. A scout came, offered him 200 pesos to sign. He says, my dad owed the grocer 200 pesos. The family was really struggling. I gave up my dream of becoming a doctor to pay the grocery bill. Now I'm on this Greyhound bus heading to Florida. And he goes, all I knew was the last stop was Miami, and I just wanted to go all the way to Miami, get a flight, and go back home. But I had signed a contract, and then he goes, and 2 years later, I decided to stay. I played in Cocoa, and 2 years after that, I'm in the outfield with Willie Mays. And I'm thinking, this guy's pretty interesting. So about the time I was getting laid off from Florida Today, I was scheduled to be down in Miami when the Giants were playing the Marlins, and Bruce Bochy is a local guy here, as you know, from Melbourne, Florida. And I got laid off the next day. I said, I'm going to go down anyway. I'll catch some baseball, kind of get my bearings. And I was in Bruce's office, and Bruce asked me, he found that he had heard, and he was upset. And Bruce and I are friends. He's the manager of the Giants. We're friends and went to Brevard Community College, and all that. His wife is from here. And what are you going to do? And I said, Bruce, all of us in print journalism were in this line. I said, I just didn't know where my spot was, but my spot was yesterday. And he said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I got some ideas. I said, I always thought Felipe Alou would be a good book. And he kind of looks at me and he goes, he's here today. And I said, what? He goes, yeah, he's here. He works for the Giants. He goes, I came after him as the manager, and they kicked him upstairs, and he became an assistant to the GM. He lives in South Florida. Said, you want me to talk to him? And that started a process of communicating with Felipe, and it took me about 4 years to get him to agree to do the book. And I'm glad he finally did, and I know he is as well, because it's getting some really good reviews. if people go to YouTube and type in Gary Thorne, Thorne, the Orioles announcer for MASN, he really did an excellent, very moving review of this book, and it's just gaining traction. It's doing well, and I think it's an important book, and I really think people will enjoy it, even if they're not baseball fans, but especially if they are.
We are visiting with Peter Kerasotis, who is the author of the book Alou, My Baseball Journey with Felipe Alou. He also is a 10-time Associated Press Sports Editor Award winner, 6 times Football Writers Association of America Award winner, and 7 times Florida Sports Writers Association Award winner. You mentioned Tony La Russa, who did a blurb for the book. Joe Torre did one. Reggie Jackson did one. And then, interestingly enough, Pedro Martinez did the foreword. And so here's a guy later who benefited from the trail that Felipe Alou blazed, getting a chance to pay some homage by doing the foreword in this book.
Yeah, we had a lot of candidates for that foreword, including just about everybody who wrote a blurb on the back. As you mentioned, were all candidates. Pedro was very, very hard to get a hold of. And Felipe was getting frustrated by that, and we were looking at Plan B. And Gordon Eads, writer who now works for the Boston Red Sox, finally got me connected with Pedro. And I talked to him for about 10, 15 minutes on the phone, and I could tell he was going to be excellent to write the foreword. And he said, I don't have time today. Why don't we schedule some time next week? Well, it took us about 5 months to get a hold of him for that conversation, and then it took me about another 5 months to get a hold of him again. But when he and I talked, a lot of people have said he really sets the tone for this book, and he considers Felipe to be like his second father. And I've gotten real close with Moises Alou's sister, his older sister, Maria. And Maria used to kind of take care of Pedro when Pedro was a young player and cook for him, and they're close friends as well. And Pedro is very intelligent, as is Felipe. And he just, we talked on the phone. I recorded it, wrote it, emailed it to him, and signed off on it. And Felipe, one of the interesting things he told me, Dan, was, he goes, in my country, in the Dominican, when you're in elementary school and you're learning Dominican history, Felipe Alou is in our history books. The Alou brothers, you study and learn about Felipe Alou and the Alou brothers, just like maybe in this country you might learn about Babe Ruth in a history book or something. They are in the history books there. And as I mentioned, he's the pioneer, he's the trailblazer, and he just had some wonderful things to say and some wonderful stories to share in that forward. It really set the tone. And
you mentioned how many players have come out of the Dominican Republic since Felipe Alou laid the groundwork for that to happen, and what in many ways what a poor country that is. My wife a number of years ago went on a mission trip to the Dominican Republic and got to see what you don't see in tourism magazines, right, and tourism commercials, and got to see some of the things. So to see those kids rising up out of that kind of abject poverty, and baseball, whether they're getting off the island or not, baseball is such a passion down there, Peter, and you've been able to capture kind of that passion in this book, and the passion that ultimately was able to get more and more and more of those Dominican players into Major League Baseball.
Yeah, he grew up, you talk about abject poverty, he grew up in a 15 by 15 foot shack, oldest of 6 kids, and his parents grew up sleeping literally on a dirt floor, and, emerges out of there and confronts the racism that he faced in this country. And, he understood the racism academically, but in real time, he didn't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And his mother was white and father black. We made this big deal about Derek Jeter back in the 90s, this interracial player. Felipe Alou was an interracial player in 1958 when he broke in with the San Francisco Giants. To have risen out of what he did to become the first player, the first in the World Series, the first manager, now a front office executive, It's an amazing story, and they revere him in the Dominican Republic. And the Giants just built a state-of-the-art baseball academy there in the Dominican, as all of the teams now have baseball academies down there, and named it after him. He is a giant figure in that country, and they know what he did for them as far as, and he's told me, he goes, there were a lot of guys that came after me that could have been really good players, maybe even Hall of Fame players, but a lot of them could not deal with the cultural change, the language barrier, the racism. A lot of them came over in the minor leagues and then went back. And it wasn't easy. It was not easy. And it took somebody, Gary Thorne in his video review calls this the Jackie Robinson story from a Latino perspective, the first time we've actually gotten that perspective.
Peter Kerasotis, who co-authored the book with Felipe Alou, joining us here on the program as we continue to chat and talk about this remarkable man and his remarkable story. You mentioned his brothers, Matty and Jesus. There could have been a fourth Alou brother in the big leagues, except for a different path that Juan chose to take. Tell us that story briefly.
Yeah, so when he resisted in doing this book, he said, there's stories that are going to hurt people if I tell them, and I don't want to do that, but if I'm going to do this book, I've got to do it 100%. I'm not going to do it watered down. So when we finally sat down, and I drove down to his house in Boynton Beach, and we were talking, at one point, this first time we really sat down, and I didn't take out a notebook or a tape recorder, we just talked for hours. And all of a sudden I said, Felipe, 6 kids, were there ever any other brothers other than you, Matty, and Jesus? And he got quiet, and he said, yeah. And he took out his wallet, and he slapped down this ID on the table, and he said, you see this ID? In my country, you have to carry this ID everywhere you go. Not your driver's license, this ID. Well, what I never knew was that they had a dictator in the Dominican, Rafael Trujillo, who was brutal. He got assassinated in the early 60s, and it threw the country into revolutionary turmoil. Mm-hmm. And Juan was a college student, and he said Juan was probably the best out of all of us, a power hitter who could hit for average like Matty. He got caught up in the revolution, was detained once by U.S. troops who were occupying the island, then got detained a second time with about a dozen other guys by the rival Dominican faction. They asked for their IDs, and they saw his, and they said, are you related to the Alou brothers? And he said, yeah, they are my brothers. They separated him from the pack. Probably most of those other guys were executed. They took him to his parents, and they said, you better get him off this island. If you don't get him off this island, this is not going to end well. They gave him sort of a mulligan because they didn't want to kill one of the Alou brothers. I mean, they were revered, and all 3 other brothers were in the major leagues. So the family sent him to Puerto Rico. He went to school there, graduated summa cum laude as a civil engineer, and still lives in Puerto Rico. But that's how his path took him. And Felipe said, those are the stories that I don't really want to tell, but it's in the book, because just because his last name was Alou didn't mean he was any better than those other boys who lost their lives.
Right.
And their families, I don't want them to read it and feel like we think we're special and their lives were not as important. That's the kind of guy he is, the kind of man he is. And that's the story of the fourth Alou brother.
Yeah, instead of being grateful for that saving his brother's life, he was more concerned about the feelings of the others who probably lost their lives. That tells you a lot about the kind of man he is, regardless of what kind of ball player he was.
Exactly. And that his character, his stature, I mean, people that know him adore him. People who don't know him just remember he was a player and a manager. They'll really get quite a story if they read this book. And again, you don't have to be a baseball fan. I keep hearing that from people. I'm not a baseball fan, but I really love this book. It's an important book, I really feel, as far as a slice of not only baseball history, but American history as well, with this influx of Latinos that have come into this country through baseball. And he was one of the pioneers.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a phenomenal read. I highly encourage people to get it. I've been showing the book cover on the screen on and off during our interview here, but I'm actually holding up now. I've got my hard copy for people to see right here in my hands, thanks to you and the good folks at the University of Nebraska Press who sent me a review copy. I'm going to give you a chance to play Pitchman, Peter. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about here, but we want people to actually buy the book. So I'll give you a chance to play Pitchman. How can they get this phenomenal book that you co-authored with Felipe Alou?
The best way is Amazon. It's in bookstores around the country, but it's kind of hit and miss. I've been to some Barnes & Noble, and they have it. Some Barnes & Noble don't. But Amazon or the University of Nebraska Press website, Barnes & Noble website, but Amazon, Barnes & Noble website, Books A Million, all the standard places are where you can get this book. And also Apple Books. You can download it if you like to read on your device. There's a Kindle format on Amazon, and Apple has it in their EPUB format if you want to download it and read it on a tablet.
Now that's the kind of guy Peter Kerasotis is, folks. He got basically booted out of the newspaper industry because of all of the online media, and here he is promoting a way for you to read his book online. Does that's either tells you what kind of guy you are, or you don't care how you sell a book. You just want to sell it, right? Hey, before you go, I prompted our audience with this. In all the years that I did the talk show on the Clemson radio station, the flagship for Clemson, and all the years that I've done things in between, every time the Masters rolls around, every year invariably I ended up telling a story about this reporter I know who the first round of golf he ever played in his life was at Augusta National on the Monday after the Masters one year in the early 90s. And some people said, Dan, you're just making that story up. Today I am vindicated because Peter Kerasotis is that reporter. Tell us that story, Peter.
I think this was around 93, and I was working at Florida Today, and I had become the columnist, and our sports editor was a guy named Tom Squires. And the one perk that Tom would give himself every year was to go to the Masters with one of the writers on the staff. And he would help, or he might write a little sidebar, but that was his one perk. So he was after me to go with him. I really didn't want to go. I wasn't a golfer. I didn't really follow golf. I knew the Masters was the premier event. My dad was a golfer. And so one year, okay, well, let's go together. And, you know, I wrote the columns that week. I think it was the year that I forget who won that year. But anyway.
Well, it had to be either 91 or 92 because those were the 2 years I was there. So it had to
Freddie
be.
Couples, I think it was the year Freddie Couples won.
Okay.
And so it was, early 90s. It probably was 92. And so we in Augusta, you have to rent houses, and we were people will go, like this woman would rent out her house every year to us, and she would go with her kid, and she'd just stay with her mother that week, and she'd rent out the house for $1,500. It was a nice little payday. So the Masters has a deal where you put your name in a hat, and the day after the final round on Sunday, providing there's no rain delay that kicks it over, they choose 20 journalists, media, print, broadcast, doesn't matter, 20 people. It's the lottery, and you get to play on Monday, and you get one of the caddies, the whole bit. So not only, and Tom had been going for years, Tom Squires, never won the lottery. Both of us won the lottery. We're both going to play Augusta National the next day. So here we are. We get back to this house that we're staying at, and he took his clubs with him every year just in case something like this would happen. He told me, if you're coming with me, get a set of golf clubs, just put them in the trunk. We're gonna enter the. I took my dad's clubs with me. We win the lottery, and there we are late that Sunday night after I filed my column and all my work. It's like 11 o'clock, midnight, and we're out on the front lawn of this house that we're renting for the week, and he's giving me golf lessons. This is the Varden grip. This is a good grip. This is what you want to do on a tee shot. This is if you're going to chip it in, and when you're putting, this is, he's just giving me golf lessons. And then, of course, the next morning we get there, and that's the first time I ever played a round of golf. Was at Augusta National, and I broke 100. I broke 100, and then we played the back nine.
Yeah, yeah. There's always that but. And people have to understand too. This is a once in a lifetime thing, right? Once you get chosen, you can never play
once
again.
Once you win the lottery, you're never able to enter the lottery again. It's a one and done deal. They know, they keep a record. You won the lottery. There's so many guys and women who want to play. Mm-hmm. So they tell you once you've won the lottery, you go into a database, and that's it. You got to play it once.
That's outstanding. As I said, today I'm vindicated because I've told that story before, and there have been people who've told me there's no way that's true. And I guess the other question is, did you retire after that? Have you played golf since?
I started playing golf after that, and I played for several years. And, during the Tiger Woods era, mm-hmm. Everybody was kind of fooling around with golf or getting interested in it. And I did play for a while, but, it's an expensive game. It's a time-consuming game, and I just kind of let things fall by the wayside, and I haven't really played in, I would say, about 10 years now. But I was playing for a while because of that, and because of the popularity that came into the game when Tiger came on the scene.
It's an incredible story. People I've told that to who have believed me, their jaws just drop, and they would kill for an opportunity to play at Augusta National under any circumstances, and to have your first round ever at Augusta National just blows people away.
Yeah, it's like turning a kid loose with crayons on a Da Vinci painting, and that was me. But I always felt like I was pretty athletic, and what I understood from that day was the allure of golf, mm-hmm. because I tell people I can't and never have been able to dunk a basketball. I played baseball pretty well, but I was never going to hit a baseball 400 feet.
Right.
But that day there were certain tee shots or chips or putts, and you say to yourself, I just sank a 10-foot putt, or I just hit a pretty good drive right down the center of the fairway. Mm-hmm. I just hit a shot that, as I started playing more, you hit that shot that is as good as any pro could hit it. If it's a par 3 and you hit it and it's 2 feet away from the pin, that's as good as any pro can hit it. And I could see the addiction of the sport right then and there, because then you start saying to yourself, if I could do that with every shot.
Uh-huh. Or for me,
that's what separates the men from the boys.
For me, when I played, and I haven't played in over a decade, but when I was playing fairly regularly and not very well, I would get frustrated and say, that's it, I'm never playing again when this round is over, and then I'd hit that one shot,
Yeah.
and it would draw you back in. So for you to have that experience at Augusta National is just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Peter, thank you so much for joining us and going over the amount of time that I said I would keep you. But
my pleasure, Dan.
I wanted people to hear that story, but more importantly, I wanted people to get a feel for this book you co-authored with Felipe Alou. Again, it's via Nebraska Press, and the best way to get it is Amazon.com. Peter, thank you so much.
Dan, nice catching up with you. All the best.
All right, I'll be in touch, my friend. Thanks.
Sure.
That was Peter Kerasotis. When we come back, we're running overtime, but we're going to stay overtime. Heath Burdett and his dad are with us, and we're going to talk about the Walk a Mile project. That is next here on the Dan Scott Show right after this break.